They said the ground here was stable. That's what the brochures promised. Solid limestone foundations, premium drainage, zero risk of subsidence. But stability is a funny thing. It looks perfect right up until it doesn't. The night the earth opened beneath Karen Delaney's backyard, I was sitting on my porch, sipping the same cheap beer she'd once written me a citation for leaving visible in public view. I heard the sound before I saw it, a deep, echoing pop, like the sky had swallowed its own breath. By morning, the queen of the Homeowners Association had no kingdom left to rule. It started, as most suburban catastrophes do, with paperwork. A form, a denial. A single stamped word that turned a summer project into geological revenge. I never cared much about control until someone tried to take mine away. And in Cypress Hollow, control was a religion. Our HOA president, Karen Delaney, worshipped it like scripture, the bylaws her Bible, the meeting minutes her commandments. She could spot an unapproved mailbox color from 50 feet away and cite the subsection that banned it by heart. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I mistook all that order for safety. The symmetry, the shine, the constant hum of sprinklers, it felt peaceful, like living inside a catalog photo. But peace here wasn't natural. It was enforced. You didn't choose tranquility, it was legislated onto you. The trouble began when I decided to build a small backyard pool. Nothing lavish, just a narrow rectangle of water to reflect the sky, something to break the monotony of beige fences and HOA newsletters. I'd saved for it for years. I filed every required document: soil survey, fencing plan, drainage layout, even the approved shade of pool deck paint. And then I waited. 2 weeks later, an envelope appeared on my porch, white, embossed, heavy enough to carry the weight of disapproval. Inside, a single sheet of paper printed in Times New Roman, stamped in red. DENIED, ground instability detected. That was it. No explanation, no data, just bureaucratic poetry, elegant in its cruelty. Ground instability. In a neighborhood that sat higher than the highway and drier than most of Florida, it sounded absurd. But Karen said it with the confidence of someone who believed the earth itself reported to her. The next morning, she made her rounds in a sun visor and clipboard, measuring lawns with that sharp little smile. I could feel her presence like static in the air, as if the soil might crumble under my disobedience. Still, I believed in reason. So I appealed. I wrote emails, attached geological assessments, cited local construction codes. Every reply came back colder, shorter, more formal. Eventually, she stopped answering at all. That's when I learned the first rule of Cypress Hollow. You can't argue with someone who thinks they own the ground beneath your feet. Reason, I decided, would have to be louder than her stamp. So I hired a geotechnical crew, men who trusted the ground more than people. They arrived before sunrise with thermoses, augers, and clipboards, speaking in the calm language of depth and density. They drilled, they measured. They extracted cylinders of soil and slid them into labeled tubes like relics. The cores told a quiet story: topsoil, clay, and then solid limestone. Dry, compacted, stable. Nothing remotely unstable. When their report arrived, it was beautiful in a bureaucratic way: graphs, charts, signatures, and one glorious conclusion. Suitable for small residential pool installation, no structural risk detected. I sent it to the HOA Architectural Committee with a note so polite it almost trembled. Surely this would end it. But reason has no weight where ego sits. The reply came back colder than granite. Denied due to aesthetic inconsistency and visual nonconformity with adjacent lots. That was the new excuse. Karen had moved from geology to taste. She claimed the pool would disrupt the harmonious visual rhythm of the neighborhood. Harmony, that's what she called uniform beige monotony. I remember standing on my back porch, looking out at that line of cloned fences, each one a prison of compliance. The air shimmered with sprinkler mist, smelling faintly of fertilizer and heat. I realized then that Karen didn't fear instability in the soil. She feared it in me. The excavators arrived the next week. At dawn, engines coughed and roared as if the ground itself were waking up. Backhoes, dump trucks, men in hard hats, all that steel confidence rolling down the street like an armored rebellion. The first bucket tore into my lawn with a metallic snarl. The air filled with the scent of wet earth and machine oil. By mid-morning, they'd carved out a rectangular wound, clean, geometric, unapologetic. Layers of soil stacked like a history lesson. Pale sand, red clay, limestone fragments glinting under the sun. I stood at the edge, watching my yard turn honest. Every shovel of dirt was a small victory against paperwork. Across the fence, Karen watched too. Silent, arms crossed, clipboard like a weapon. Her patio umbrella cast a perfect circle of shadow, the last fragment of control she had left. She didn't shout, she didn't wave. She just documented. By noon, the neighborhood was awake. People slowed their cars, pretending to check mailboxes that weren't theirs. Dog walkers adjusted routes for better sightlines. Phones came out for innocent photos. Every sound echoed, the crunch of gravel, the hydraulic hiss, the beep of a reversing truck. Each note of construction carried a quiet defiance. The pit grew deeper. Moist air rose from the earth, rich and mineral, like breathing in time itself. Floodlights came on at dusk. The site glowed white, turning the pit into a kind of theater. The smell of diesel and clay mingled with humidity. Moths battered themselves against the lamps until their wings dusted the light with shadows. From my porch, I could see the shapes of rebar and tools, ghostly in the haze. The ground looked alive like it had veins. Then came the letters. Karen worked fast. A cease and desist taped to my mailbox. A printed warning about construction noise past permitted hours. A note citing light pollution impacting community tranquility. She wrote like a general at war with reality. Every envelope had her signature, bold, precise, angry. Every sentence felt like a paper barricade. But the work went on. The contractors were unfazed. They'd seen worse: sinkholes, floods, full-blown lawsuits. A suburban tyrant with a clipboard didn't scare them. They poured gravel, checked the slope, and laid rebar in clean, straight grids. Each metal line caught the moonlight like threads of defiance. At night, I watched from the window. The floodlights reflected off the unfinished pit, painting my ceiling with shifting rectangles. The hum of the generator droned like an electric heartbeat. Across the fence, Karen's porch light never went off. I imagined her pacing, highlighting clauses, citing bylaws, writing new definitions for acceptable behavior. By the third night, the air felt thick. Even the silence had humidity. Thunder rolled somewhere far away, the kind of thunder that never quite arrives. The neighborhood slept under that uneasy heaviness, pretending not to feel the vibration that came with every scoop of earth. You could sense it, the tension spreading outward, a pressure not geological but social. The whole block leaned toward disapproval. And somewhere beneath it all, the actual ground stayed calm. Because the truth is, dirt doesn't care about paperwork. It doesn't care about authority or bylaws. It only listens to weight, to water, to time. And by the time the excavation reached its final depth, I could feel something shifting under more than just my yard. It wasn't the soil. It was the story. The night it happened, the air felt wrong. Heavy, swollen, humming with that late summer charge that makes every sound a little sharper. The kind of humidity that turns the streetlights into halos and the sky into a bruise. All day, the neighborhood had buzzed with low-grade panic. More letters, more whispers, more side-eye glances from driveways that looked cloned. The pit in my yard sat waiting, neat and reinforced, a silent rebuke to everything Karen believed about order. By sunset, even the cicadas sounded tired. Their rhythm slowed, the air thickening until every breath tasted faintly of metal. Around 11, I was sitting on the back steps, beer sweating in my hand, listening to the low thrum of generators from a few streets over. A normal night in suburbia. Sprinklers ticking, air conditioners growling, the faint chemical sweetness of fertilizer drifting across the fences. Then the ground made a sound I had never heard before. A boom not loud but deep, round, and hollow, like a drum being struck underfoot. It rolled through my bones, lingered, then dissolved into silence so clean it rang. I waited for a second noise, thunder, a transformer pop, anything. But the sky stayed still. No flash, no storm. Just silence. Then came the scream of metal, a brief rattle of chain link, and the unmistakable groan of something collapsing inward. I looked toward Karen's house. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. Then I saw her patio tilt. A line opened through the yard like an unzipping seam. And then gone. Half of her garden vanished. The ground folded inward with a sigh, slow and almost elegant, as if the soil had been waiting politely for permission. By the time I reached the fence, her floodlights had cut out, leaving only the strobe of motion sensors flashing on and off like panic itself. The air smelled of wet clay and ozone. Somewhere, a water line hissed under the earth. I called 911, my voice steady in that strange way it gets when disbelief wears a suit of calm. I didn't need words. The dispatch transcript later said enough. 911 log 5721, ground collapse, no injuries. 11:04 p.m. Caller reports major subsidence event, rear yard of residential property. 11:06 p.m. Units dispatched, lights visible from main road. 11:10 p.m. Scene secured, awaiting city engineer and code enforcement. Clinical detached. Exactly the opposite of what it felt like standing there, the fence vibrating under my hand, the air still trembling from the shock. Neighbors spilled out of their houses in bathrobes and disbelief. Phones glowed. Whispers clung to the humid air like gnats. I didn't join them. I just watched as the emergency trucks rolled in, painting everything in red and blue strobes that made the whole look alive. The crater was perfectly round, about 20 feet across and 12 deep. Smooth walls of exposed clay. Edges sharp as if carved by geometry itself. At the bottom, a tangle of what used to be Karen's patio furniture gleamed in the floodlights. Twisted metal, shattered tile, the remains of a world obsessed with balance. Someone's garden hose still dangled into the void, dripping a slow, rhythmic pulse that echoed off the hollow like a metronome. Officials moved in with that brisk choreography of trained disbelief. Tripods, laser levels, caution tape snapping in the night breeze. I stood back unseen, listening to phrases carried on radios. Void cavity, structural compromise, possible secondary collapse. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen. Her windows stayed dark. Her perfect drapes hung undisturbed, framing absence. For once, she wasn't observing, she was the observation. The crowd thinned near midnight. Reporters arrived, then left when nothing else fell. The air cooled slightly, the adrenaline evaporating into the kind of quiet that feels borrowed. I walked the perimeter once more. The soil at the edges crumbled like stale cake beneath my shoes. Moisture glimmered in the pit, reflecting the emergency lights like red mercury. It was both beautiful and obscene, nature writing its own audit report. That night lying in bed, I could still feel it. Not shaking, breathing. The earth had inhaled, and the neighborhood held its breath with it. The following morning, the street was a museum exhibit. Yellow tape fluttered like nervous birds. City engineers knelt with clipboards, pointing at the ground the way doctors point at X-rays. News vans idled with their antennas up like metallic weeds. The HOA email went out at 9:14 a.m. sharp. Dear residents, there has been a minor ground incident affecting property 17. Please refrain from speculation until the proper assessments are complete. Your cooperation maintains community harmony. Harmony, always harmony. Meanwhile, half her yard was missing. I stood at my window watching the officials measure, sample, photograph. Every movement deliberate. Every voice hushed. I realized that the phrase, ground instability, had finally become real, just not in my yard. It was strange justice. Slow, quiet, unarguable. You can't appeal to the earth. It doesn't recognize your authority. It only waits until you pretend too long, and then it reclaims the lie. By sunrise, the sinkhole had a fan club. News vans lined the street, cables coiled across sidewalks like black vines. Drones hovered, cameras glinting as they caught the morning light off wet clay. The HOA board, minus one president, gathered in polite panic near the cul-de-sac, polos tucked in, clipboards shaking in the humid breeze. The scene looked less like a neighborhood and more like a press conference for the end of control. City engineers arrived first, then the environmental team, then the insurance investigators, their trucks marked with logos that said restoration in fonts that promised nothing. They moved with quiet authority, measuring, drilling, scanning the ground with radar units that hummed like polite thunder. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, pretending to read the newspaper but really reading the air, that tense silence of professionals discovering something worse than anyone wanted to admit. When they began marking lines with spray paint across the lawns, I saw the pattern forming. It wasn't random. The sinkhole's edges traced an invisible path that curved through multiple backyards, like a river trying to remember where it once flowed. One of the engineers knelt beside his equipment, eyes squinting at the monitor. He said something to the others. They all looked toward the park. And then, quietly, everything started to make sense. That afternoon, the city posted preliminary findings on a clipboard nailed to a temporary fence. I walked over with the rest of the curious, a cluster of bathrobes, baseball caps, and suspicion. The report was brief, factual, clinical. Preliminary assessment indicates collapse along a historical drainage corridor, filled and compacted circa late 1980s during residential expansion. Improper fill composition and gradual erosion likely contributed to structural failure. The words improper fill were underlined in pen, probably by someone angry enough to want emphasis. Someone in the crowd murmured that the HOA had approved the park extension back in 1987. Someone else mentioned Karen's name. And suddenly the air changed. The story wasn't about the hole anymore. It was about the paper trail. Later that day, I drove to City Hall. The records office smelled like dust and fluorescent lights, the scent of long memory. It didn't take long to find the old permits. Cypress Hollow subdivision, phases 3 and 4. Stamped, signed, and dated in fading blue ink. And there it was. Page after page. Karen Delaney's signature. Dozens of them. She'd been on the original HOA expansion committee. Her name listed as Liaison to Development Oversight. The same committee that had petitioned to reroute storm runoff through private property, the same path now collapsing under her house. The official language was elegant. Phrases like compacted fill applied to previous trench system, and soil stabilization achieved through localized backfill. But there was no record of inspection, no soil reports, no confirmation that the work was ever actually done. Just a signature, hers. When the city engineers made their next public statement, the cameras were ready. The lead engineer, a tired man with a clipboard and sunburn, spoke with the gravity of geology itself. He explained that the instability zone traced directly along a buried drainage trench that had been sealed decades earlier, improperly, cheaply, quietly. The fill inside had slowly eroded over 30 years of sprinkler runoff and rainfall, creating a honeycomb of voids. When the pressure built high enough, it simply collapsed. Reporters asked about responsibility. He didn't point fingers. He didn't have to. Everyone already knew who had buried the truth, both literally and on paper. By the end of the week, the HOA's inbox was a battlefield. Residents demanded refunds. Insurance companies wanted statements. Contractors refused liability. The board called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, minus Karen, of course. She stopped showing her face. Her email auto-reply simply read, "Under review." The irony didn't need explaining. For years, she'd lectured us about personal accountability and collective responsibility. Now, the entire neighborhood was discovering how fragile her empire of order really was. The perfect lawns, The synchronized fences. All of it had been built on something rotten. City officials moved quickly. Inspectors mapped the subsurface voids across the subdivision, red spray paint marking danger zones like open wounds. The sinkhole was the deepest, but it wasn't alone. There were pockets, small, hidden cavities beneath driveways, sidewalks, garden beds. Each one a reminder that control doesn't last forever. The homeowners were told not to panic. The HOA issued another newsletter that started with, "In these uncertain times," and ended with, "Your cooperation ensures community unity." But unity was already gone. For the first time since I'd moved in, people were talking openly, not just over fences, but in driveways, on porches, in the glow of their phones. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the illusion she had sold us. The idea that rules could protect you from decay. That paperwork could outsmart gravity. A few days later, I watched city workers dump crushed limestone into the hole, load after load, each truck beeping its warning before spilling a cascade of pale rock into the void. It looked temporary. It always does. They fenced it off, hung signs, took photos, and drove away. But I noticed something the engineers didn't. When the sun hit the mound just right, you could still see the faint curve of the original trench extending toward the park, a pale scar cutting through the green. Like the earth itself was marking the memory of what had been done to it. Across the street, Karen's house sat dark. Her lawn yellowed. Her mailbox leaned slightly toward the hole, like it was listening. And every night, when the wind shifted just enough, you could hear the soft hiss of settling rock. A sound that wasn't quite collapse, but wasn't stability either. Something in between, the earth adjusting its posture after being lied to for too long. For a while, it felt like the neighborhood stopped breathing. The trucks left. The tape sagged. The hole became just another line item on the HOA agenda, ongoing remediation issue 12. But every morning, I saw it first thing from my kitchen window. A void pretending to be a yard. A scar that never quite healed. At sunrise, mist pooled in it like breath in a lung. By afternoon, the sun baked the rock fill into pale crust. At night, dew gathered again, and the hollow exhaled. The ground was learning how to breathe without her. Karen's house sat empty for weeks. Her blinds stayed drawn. Her mailbox overflowed with envelopes stamped urgent. Rumor said she'd moved in with her sister across town, pending legal consultation. Others claimed she was still inside, curtains shut, convinced the earth might try again. Either way, the HOA stopped saying her name. They referred to her only as former administration. But the name didn't matter anymore. Everyone knew who had dug the hole, on paper and in spirit. By late August, rain began to visit every afternoon. Not storms, just long, soaking rain, the kind that smells like rust and relief. Each time, the hole filled a little more. The limestone settled, the clay softened, the depression deepened. Until one morning, there was water. Not puddled rainwater, a real body of it. Dark, still glassy. It reflected everything. The sky, the fences, the leftover caution tape fluttering like faded prayer flags. Children started calling it Lake Karen. They threw pebbles in it, watched the ripples, dared each other to stand close. Their laughter echoed off the houses that used to echo only lawnmowers and gossip. The HOA tried to fence it off again, but the posts kept leaning as if the ground refused obedience. Soon the barrier sagged like a failed apology. Meanwhile, my pool was finished. Blue tile, clean lines, quiet water. When I floated there at dusk, I could see the reflection of her pond beyond the fence, two mirrors facing each other across a thin strip of grass. One planned, one accidental, both the same size. The symmetry was perfect, almost cruel. Sometimes, when the light was just right, her water caught the glow from my porch lamps, turning the surface into a dim echo of mine. A twin born from spite and gravity. The neighborhood adjusted in the strange way suburbs do, by pretending adjustment was always part of the plan. The board elected a new president. Emails went out about rebuilding trust. Volunteers formed committees for ground safety awareness. Someone proposed a memorial garden near the site. Another suggested draining the water and filling it again, properly this time. Nothing happened. Nature had already claimed the real memorial. Birds visited in the mornings, egrets, herons, things that didn't care about zoning codes. Insects skated on the surface tension like they'd been waiting for this all along. Every reflection rippled with quiet judgment. I still get the occasional letter from the new HOA, each one polite and frightened. They ask about maintenance schedules, noise ordinances, shrub heights. But the tone is different now. Cautious, soft, as if the ground beneath their sentences might collapse if they pressed too hard. And maybe it would, because everyone remembers the night the earth reminded us who it belongs to. The night a perfect lawn swallowed itself. On the anniversary, I stood at the fence as the sun went down. My pool on one side, blue, geometric, intentional. Lake Karen on the other, dark, organic, inevitable. Between them, the reflection of a single cloud moved slowly from one surface to the other, like a thought changing its mind. That's when it struck me. Control and erosion are the same story told at different speeds. We spend our lives compacting the soft parts, emotions, accidents, time, trying to make them bear weight. We file permits. We write rules. We call it stability. But sooner or later, everything sinks back into the earth. Even us. The neighborhood is quieter now. People wave more. Lawn mowers pause when thunder rolls. The HOA still sends out monthly reports, but the signatures have changed. There's no more bold red ink, no more underlines, no more sermons about compliance. Just updates like whispers, pond depth stable, no further movement detected. The engineers call it a retention feature now. The kids still call it Lake Karen. And I call it balance. Because every time I look at it, I'm reminded that the ground has a longer memory than paper. And that sometimes, the only real permit worth having is patience. She tried to control the ground beneath us. But the ground had other plans. Others just keep ringing in your ears. For more daily HOA stories, click like and subscribe.